Even today, oh, there we go. No, even today, when I hear the word kingdom, the images that come to mind are right out of the books I read when I was a child. You know the kind of kingdom I'm talking about. Far, far away places ruled by royalty, good royalty, sporting jeweled crowns and wielding magnificent scepters, places of peace and prosperity with picturesque little villages and happy, cooperative inhabitants, places where if bad things happen at all, they get worked out and everyone lives happily ever after. I just can't not have that come up when I hear that word kingdom. So many of us got to have that reactivated, at least in part, when we watched the royal wedding some weeks ago, didn't we? For there was the Queen and her family in those amazing, some of them in amazing hats and outfits, all decked out in their very expensive finery. And then as they watched the wedding of a fairy tale prince and princess presided over by bishops, also in their finery, though they didn't get mentioned a lot. They didn't call out that that was the Archbishop of Canterbury leading the vows. So all in a magnificent church, after which the couple rode in a horse-drawn carriage through adoring crowds of people shouting positive things and waving flags. And so at least some of us today, maybe not all of us, carry within us these childhood notions that a kingdom is a tranquil, happy place presided over by those in positions of authority and privilege, a place of stability, a place, you might say, where we know our places, and well, it's okay, it's all right, we can trust them. In our readings for today, we have two very different kingdom stories. In our reading from the book of Samuel, first book of Samuel, and then from Mark's Gospel. First, the story that you heard 3 years ago about the choice of David as the king of Israel, the beginning of a story of the fulfillment of Israel's own dream of a stable and unified kingdom. We have that story. And then secondly, we have Jesus' own parable of something he calls over and over again in the Gospel of Mark, the kingdom of God. David, of course, was Israel's most celebrated king. He wasn't the first. You heard about the first, Saul, who, by the way, was very, very tall, as legend has it. Chosen when a shepherd boy, David was as close to an ideal king as Israel would ever have. Even in his weakest moments, even in his most shameful moments, David was beloved of God, symbolizing Israel's longing for the kind of king and the kind of stable kingdom of my childhood storybooks. Some of this same longing also became focused on the line of David, on the reign of David's son Solomon, the king who built that magnificent temple that we saw a little piece of in that royal wedding, this beautiful temple that just speaks solidity and permanence and rightness. In looking back on King Solomon's rule, some biblical writers search for an image that would express the kind of majestic stability that the line of David brought to the people. And what they came up with was this. Solomon's kingdom, again the continuing line of David, was like the grand cypress groves in Lebanon, a group of massive and majestic trees that towered over everything, that seemed to have a kind of permanency that everybody longed for. This very image would later get picked up in the writing of the prophets, who described the people at their best as being like great trees nourished by constant waters, something that could be in short supply in Israel. And so as we get to our second story, when Jesus comes along and tells his parables of the kingdom of God, his audience would have expected him to speak about what? Majestic, towering trees, trees planted next to and nourished by springs of water. They would have expected an image evoking a past glorious kingdom, or reassuring them that the coming kingdom of God would be powerful, permanent, majestic in the eyes of the world, ruled by a compassionate and justice-loving king, Jesus himself. But this isn't the kind of image Jesus used when speaking about the kingdom of God. No, Jesus says that the kingdom of God is not like a massive, permanent grove of trees. Instead, Jesus says, it's the kind of low-growing bush that pops up when someone sows a tiny little mustard seed, like a grain of rice or salt in the ground. So you can only imagine the shock of his listeners, for the two things are the grove of trees and the mustard bush are of completely different sizes and standing. One a towering, massive piece of nature, and the other low to the ground. But the differences are even more than that, not just about size. For the mustard bushes that Jesus would have been talking about were actually invasive weeds in the country and for the audience he was speaking to. Weeds full of plant energy, ready to spread, difficult to root out, the way the weeds are in your garden if you're lucky enough to have a garden. This is how God's kingdom really works, Jesus is saying. The kingdom of God is less like a massive and majestic grove of trees for us to find our place under and to admire. No, it's more like a weed with all of its weedy plant energy, with all its ability to spread, with all its resistance to being rooted out, a weed that crops up and burrows through the hardest of materials, opening the way for new life and growth where nothing had been there before, where you didn't think it was possible for anything to be there before. So based on this image, this is what I imagine Jesus is saying to us this morning. Jesus might be saying, you may think that compassion and justice and peace can only come into being when the kingdoms, when the kings and queens of the world, when the prime ministers and premiers and presidents of the world, when the bishops of the world and archbishops of the world embrace and enact these things within and from the kind of institutions that they preside over. You know, we wait for the solution to come down from on high, wherever that is. But what I say to you is this, I imagine Jesus saying, we, you and I are the kingdom. We, when we are hopeful, when we are compassionate, when we are justice-seeking, when we make peace, when we are these things, we are the kingdom. For our actions, as small and as obscure as we may think they are, our actions, because they are small, have the power to take root in invisible and out-of-the-way places, have the power to break apart and break open the institutions of this world, and have the power to spread like some sort of divine weed. We are the kingdom. I don't know about you, but I find this way of thinking liberating, because I can get paralyzed by what's not going on. Name the level, the provincial level, the national level, the international level, south of the border, over, you name it. For it means, when we look at it this way, that we don't have to pin all our hopes on the kings or queens or premiers or prime ministers or presidents or bishops or archbishops or priests of this world to enact what Jesus invites us to be. We have only to believe that in our baptism we have been made citizens of the kingdom of God, that our presence and actions do matter, that we in our small actions of compassion, peacemaking, and justice we do. Oh, there we go. All right. All right, let me just roll it back a little bit. I find this way. We have only to believe that in our baptism we have been made citizens. Notice the different change in language. Or you might say we're our own kings and queens, the royal priesthood. Citizens of the kingdom of God, that our presence and actions matter, that we in all our small actions of compassion, peacemaking, and justice seeking, like so many divine weeds, crack the world open so that something new can take root. So Eric and I saw this yesterday. We're living in East Vancouver right now, and unbeknownst to us, we were walking the dog, who's not here today, sorry, and we saw a notice of a yard sale for the whole neighborhood, that the proceeds of which were being raised by a group to bring a refugee family to Canada. And there they were, Eric bought banana bread, and we looked at some other things. I luckily didn't take anything home. But it was these little tiny acts of conversation and pulling things together that, that is going to mean everything. It's going to mean that another family is going to be taken from a desperate situation and brought here among us. So that's just it was somebody's little idea to have a yard sale. They've had a bunch of them, and I think they're in excess of $30,000 right now. So some weeks ago, I ordered a poster from the UK, from a little out-of-the-way press. I love letterpress. I love seeing who's doing letterpress, what seems like the ancient art of letterpress. And there's this wonderful little letterpress organization in the UK that had printed this great little poster with bees on it, because bees, for me, are a symbol of so many things. When the tube arrived, in it was a little yellow something. It's like a postcard somebody had stuck down in there that must go out with everything they send out, and must evidently represent where they are in terms of a perspective on life. It was a quote from a U.S. historian and social activist whose name is Howard Zinn. He wrote extensively about and worked for civil rights in the U.S. during a time when many in power, that I would call them the kings and queens of the U.S., were completely unreliable and unhelpful as they tried to bring justice to that situation. For me, Zen's words get at what it's like to look for and enact the kingdom of God. It wasn't the language he used. A kingdom that is about hope and attention to the good in the world. A kingdom that is about our own empowerment. A kingdom that is about God finding a way to break open all that would inhibit the human spirit and to make room for something living and true, something divine to take root. He says this: to be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act. and at least the possibility of sending this spending top of a world in a different direction. And if we do act, in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future, a kingdom, in other words. The future is an infinite succession of present moments. And to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory. When you do that, you are the kingdom. When you do that, you are the kingdom. When we do this, we are the kingdom.